Thank you, Dr. King, for this lovely introduction. And thank you, Professor Case Baker, for making this possible. But there's a third person I have to thank. That's my wife Gail. And without her, I would not be here. In fact, thousands of people would not have heard my story, but it's thanks to her and the hours she's spending on email and on telephone, trying to organize things with the various people who are responsible for these talks. Without her, nothing would have happened, and this would not have happened. So thank you, Gail. I really am humbled by these introductions. I have to tell you this. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to come to your school to speak here. You invited me because I'm a Holocaust survivor. The Holocaust being undoubtedly, as you heard from Dr. King, the most horrific and the most deadly event of the 20th century. No question about that. It was genocide. It was the ultimate crime against humanity perpetrated by human beings. It was an organized mass murder of 6 million people, innocent human beings, children, women, men, all innocent. And this sort of thing does not happen overnight. I do want to impress that on you. Anti-Semitism, let me stop here for a moment. Does everybody know what anti-Semitism means? Would you, those of you who do know, would you raise your hands? Okay. Well, this is a compliment to the school that you're in, because you've heard the word somewhere. You must have heard it here also, or perhaps for the first time here. So anti-Semitism is really hatred of all that touches and relates to Judaism and to Jewish people and to Jewish practice. And contrary to what you might think, this thing has been around for 19 centuries. 19 long centuries in various parts of Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa. And it's something totally unique in form of organization. I'm talking now about the Holocaust, in form of its execution, in form of its number of people that were touched and that were annihilated, that were from whom the life was taken away, in old age or young age, even as babies, of course. So I want you to know one thing, and that always bothers me when I get an invitation to speak to a small group, a big group, or whatever, that I have not come here to entertain you with my story. There are jillions of stories that are more important than mine and even more horrific than mine. I've come here because I want to make a contribution to your education. And to know about the Holocaust is really something absolutely necessary. I came here to impress you that the Holocaust did happen, and that was pointed out by Professor Casey already. Yes, it did happen, contrary to those who deny that it happened, and who suggest that this is an invention of some Jewish people. I want you to know, and again, this is terribly important even before I start telling you my story, that the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler was not a madman. He was not crazy, contrary to what people have suggested. He was not crazy. He was a vile, mean-spirited monster. He was a megalomaniac. He was a man who wanted to see himself, and he was seen all the time, every day. And he wanted for people to hear him, and he was heard just about every day on the radio. I heard him, my parents heard him, and he made us sick. And he wanted really to rule the whole world. Those who disagreed with him fell from his grace and were simply eliminated. You can eliminate people legally. All this happened legally, I want you to know. So I came here because I fear that many nations and their leaders in our present time have never learned or have already forgotten the lessons that past history offers us. Germany between 1939 and 1945 was really at the zenith of political and military success, and then came the descent into chaos. Many millions of people lost their lives, and that includes Germans, of course. And then there came post-war suffering, Germans, of course, and many other nations. And then came a descent into chaos. Many millions of people's lives were lost. And then came post-war suffering. We don't realize how far these terrible situations stretch out beyond the official end, you might say. So Hitler thought he could stand up against the whole world. He just knew that others were ignorant. He just knew. He considered himself to be a Superman. This thinking made no sense, of course, and it makes no sense now in various other nations. The United States of America that I love, that has offered me a haven as a refugee from communism when I came here in 1948, a country that I love, as I said. Make no mistake, in our modern world, there is no country, including our own country, that can go it alone nowadays. It doesn't work. We and our leaders sometimes think that we know and that the rest of the world is ignorant. Wrong, I assure you. We have to cooperate with others, and perhaps we all are to some extent ignorant. So I beg you to listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you, and I beg you to learn from what I'm going to tell you. And those of you who are students here, I beg you to continue talking about yourself, to yourselves, with your friends, and to discuss things with your teachers, and to ask your teachers about advice here and there. We cannot go it alone. I've learned that over a long period of time. So let me also say that I have confidence in you, because I have confidence in this school, about which I've heard a lot of good things being said, that you people are learning important things, and that you people will make a difference in the lives of your own families and yourselves, and among other people with whom you'll have relationships. So I've heard a number of Holocaust survivors speak. Not a whole lot of them, but a good many of them. And so many Holocaust survivors begin by saying, you know, I woke up one day and the world had changed. Well, that's a wrong beginning, in my opinion. It's incorrect, because anti-Semitism, that terrible term that I mentioned before, has been around for 19 centuries, and perhaps even longer than that. So I want to tell you one of the very first experiences of anti-Semitism that I had. I am a native of Český Těšín, a town in Czechoslovakia. I was born in 1927. So what I'm going to tell you about happened when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was coming home with a friend of mine who was a Hasidic Jew. Some of you may not know what Hasidic means. Hasidic means that he came from a family that was very observant, okay? My family was not very observant. My father, despite the fact that he was the last president of the Jewish congregation in our town, was not terribly observant, okay? We were what some call assimilated Jewish people. Yes, we were Jews, absolutely. We never denied that. So anyway, we walked home, hand in hand, we held hands. He was a very nice-looking kid and good fellow. And there are railroad lines that go through the middle of our town. In order to go from one side to the other, there is an underground passage. So you go down a few steps, then there's a tunnel-like area, and up a few steps, you're on the other side. So Jacob and I, Walter, went down the steps. We were down in the tunnel. It was dark down there. And suddenly, rocks were being thrown at us. And people were screaming, young people, our age people, little older people than I, Žid, Židek, Špinavi Židek. Žid, in just about all Slavic languages, means Jew. And Špinavi Židek means filthy little Jew. And the rocks were coming at us. And so he and I started running, and we saved ourselves. I saved myself behind the door of an apartment house that had a glass door and could see what was going on. He was running in the other direction, and a bunch of kids behind him. Well, at that very point, when they were about to grab this kid, Jacob, my friend, the town idiot came about. What's a town idiot? Well, in Europe, there are such crazy things as town idiots. He was a man who was mentally challenged. He looked rather strange, okay? He had long hair, blonde hair, curly hair, deeply lined face. And he picked up the trash in the street and the droppings of the horses. He came with a two-wheeled cart, picked up Jacob, put him on his cart. He looked like a Roman charioteer, and off he went and deposited this little boy in front of the house of his parents. His father was a tailor. Now, this is a simple story, but there's much more behind that story, because I want to tell you what would have happened if Jacob and I had been caught. That is the important point, because that happened to a number of other kids. Well, what would have happened is that they would have pulled down his pants and his underpants, and they would have looked at his penis, which is, in Jewish tradition, circumcised. And young people's penises in Europe at that time were not circumcised. So that's a sign he is a Jew. And we are circumcised because of a commandment that we find in the book of Genesis given to Abraham, okay? So whether it's good or bad, we're not going to discuss here. If you don't know what circumcision is, this is not show and tell. So anyway, he and I would have been beaten up. That's what would have happened. And that sort of thing marks you for the rest of your life. And the other anti-Semitic motions and things that happen to Jews that mark you. And so, for instance, I am still not quite over this, having lived in America since 1948. Many Jews still look over their shoulders to see who is following them. Now, this is hard to understand for people who have been born here, brought up here in a country of freedom. This is not to say that anti-Semitism is gone from America. It's still here. And not so long ago, Jews could not become members of the Asheville Country Club. Okay? It's fairly recent change. Okay. So, propaganda. What I want to ask you, and I want you to think about, is how did these kids, just a little bit older than I and Jacob, how did they learn to become anti-Semitic? Give it some thought. Where could they have learned this? Well, they've learned it from their parents. They've learned it from the preachers, from the priests, from the teachers. Are you with me? Okay? That's what education does to you, bad education. Fortunately, we're better off in America than we were in Europe at that particular time. Okay, so propaganda. People are being poisoned, and they were poisoned. German propaganda was fantastically strong. Anti-Semitic propaganda was powerful, and you heard it again and again. And the outcome of it was that 6 million people were murdered, 14 people in my own family. How could it have happened? People disappeared. Now, if somebody disappeared from the house next to yours, would you make any move? Would you ask where these people were taken to or went to? I think you probably would. Well, in that particular time in Europe, nobody asked. People disappeared. I have one uncle who simply disappeared. He didn't come back after the war. His name also happened to be Walter, by the way. So what happened? So in Europe, I want you to know, everybody was a Christian. In Germany, most of them were Lutherans, some were Roman Catholics. So what happened to the teaching of Jesus? Love your neighbor as yourself. What happened to it? I would like for you to think about this. I mean, this is serious stuff. I mean, are we just mouthing things, or have we internalized some of the teachings that tell us how important love is? So when people disappear, you have to ask questions. And when you find out what happened to them, you have to protest. And let me tell you something else that you may or may not know if you haven't studied the subject. When I speak, as I do now to you, you may think that all the Germans were Hitlerites. They were not. There was what's called a confessing church in Germany. And you may have heard, some of you may have heard about a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for instance, who once cried out, wrote this. He said, wer nicht für die Juden schreit, darf auch nicht Gregorianisch singen. He who doesn't cry out for Jews must not ever have the guts, the gumption to sing Gregorian chant in a church. You see, I mean, there were people who were righteous, absolutely. There was in Berlin a Roman Catholic priest who was the canon of the St. Hedwig's Church, who 1 year before the Holocaust started in 1938, in other words, when during the night of broken crystals, walked through the street and saw what was happening to Jewish businesses and to Jewish people who were assaulted, whose properties were decimated, were stolen, who were forced to clean sidewalks with the toothbrushes. And people enjoyed that and laughed about it. And that particular man, Bernhard Lichtenberg, Father Bernhard Lichtenberg, in every mass he did in his church, he said in his church, he prayed for the Jewish people. And there were Gestapo people there, there were SS people there, and he was arrested a number of times. And he was finally arrested for the last time, was sent to the concentration camp of Dachau and died on the train. There were decent people there. You may have heard, I want to mention one more, a Christian pastor by the name of Niemöller, who said this: first they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the socialists, but I was not a socialist, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, and so I did not speak up. And then they came for me, and then there was no one left to speak up for me. You may have heard that before. It's a fantastic saying, and it's a true saying, something that makes sense. So we have to speak up, yes. And the other thing that I tell my students, you know, I've asked them, why are you a Christian? Why are you a Jew? And the people, the young people look at me and say, well, I just am. Well, it is because you were born into a Jewish family, because you were born into a Christian family. Very few people change their faith. That's why you are that. And for that, you're going to be killed because you were born to parents whom you didn't choose. The thing is mad. The thing is insanity. Unfortunately, there are insane people around us. Okay, so let me tell you how it started for me. I was 12 years old when the Nazis occupied my town. It was September 1st, 1939, outbreak of World War II. That night, went to bed, you know. I woke up early the next morning on September 2nd, and I couldn't fall back asleep. Something scary was going on in my mind. And so I went in search of my dad. My dad was my ideal. My father was the best father in the world, as was my mother the best mother in the world. And I found my father not lying next to my mother, but on a balcony in back of the house. And my father was white as the environment here, the walls. And I walked up to my dad and I said, "What's going on?" And my dad said, "Listen, Walty." And I listened. I heard this chaotic noise, things breaking, crushing, things being busted up, singing, all kind of stuff I'd never heard mixed together, you know. And so I asked my dad, "What's going on?" And my dad, very quietly, with his hands on my head, said to me, "Walter, I think they are burning our synagogue." You know what a synagogue is? Okay. It's like a church for Christians, synagogue for Jews. I could see my father was terribly upset. I didn't understand too much about it. There were ashes in the air that settled on me. I was scared. Went back to bed. The next morning, we went out to see what had happened, and our synagogue was in ruins. There were a few walls standing. The scrolls, you could see inside because the windows were busted out, the stained glass windows, all the glass lying around on the ground. The holy scrolls that are in the synagogue, Genesis to Deuteronomy in Hebrew, were unrolled, smoking still. And I looked, and I didn't understand. I was 8 or 9 years old. And there were people standing around there. Now, I said I didn't understand, but what I really didn't understand was not what had happened to the building, but the fact that nobody said hello to my father, because my father was well known. He was a lawyer. He was a respected person in town. And on Sunday morning, when we walked around, people would take off their hats and say, "Good morning, Dr. Ziffer." And my sister and I, walking with my dad, would say, "Daddy, who was that?" And my dad would say, "If God doesn't know him better than I, he's in trouble." So he was very well known. And on that morning, when we stood there, when people walked by and said things like, "Oh, well, they had it coming to them. Oh, well, why should they be surprised about us Jews?" Okay? On that morning, nobody knew us anymore. That was the watershed, you might say, between us having been people who were respected, who had an identity, and people who had become outlaws. Shortly afterwards, we were forced to wear armbands, white armbands with a blue star of David, 6-pointed star. And then short times after, maybe a month later, we had to wear a yellow star. Written in the middle was Jude, which means in German, Jew. So we were identified as outlaws. Now imagine my mother, for instance, who tried to buy groceries on the market, had tremendous problems getting provisions for a family to eat because it was not good to be seen with a Jew in the street or in the market. Fortunately, my mother had a wonderful reputation, and the farmers who brought the things in were good to us, and they just took care of us. So we never went hungry during that particular time. And then evictions began, evictions. We were evicted 4 times. The first time, we had a beautiful apartment. My father had about 2,000 books in his library. Everything had to be left there. We walked out with, I don't know, a few suitcases, clothing. We had had a maid before the war, and we were able to give to her a couple of oil pictures that my mother loved, a few coins, maybe gold coins, silver coins. I really don't know. But that woman was the only person that took care of us, who expressed her love for us and took a tremendous chance to save these things for us. To scroll things ahead, let me tell you that when we finally came back from the concentration camps, she returned to us every one piece we had given to her. A wonderful, wonderful woman. Malchi Kuryanova was her name. We loved her as much, almost as much as we loved our mother. So evictions, squeezed together more and more people into smaller and smaller spaces, and we finally ended up in a ghetto. And the ghetto was at the periphery, in the periphery of our town, an old entertainment complex that had not been functioning for many, many years, cobwebs everywhere, huge halls like this, 2 or 3 of them, and people strung wires crosswise and hung sheets or other pieces of clothing, of material on these wires to create little compartments, 12 by 12 or something like that. And there were 1,000 people in that ghetto. Well, you don't have to use a lot of imagination to think, to imagine what things looked like and how people lived. But having suggested to you that it was a horrible time for these 1,000 people, I want to tell you it was one of the best times in my life. And that doesn't make sense, does it? But it does make sense if you know what love means. Because I fell in love with a little girl who was just about a year older than I, who had golden hair and green eyes. And I loved her to pieces, and it was reciprocated. And we played ping pong, and she lost every match. And she just laughed. And her laughter was like, to me, sounded like silver bells going off. So we loved each other. And then one evening, my father, my mother, my sister, and I lived on the stage of one of these dance halls, and there were 2 other families on each side. Lydia was her name, and she came to see me in the evening and said, "Walter, I have sad news." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And she said, "My parents decided to escape from the ghetto clandestinely, to somehow get east to Poland and then later on into Russia, which was still a haven for Jewish people at that time." Well, it was a terrible shock. Obviously, we embraced, we said goodbye, and tears streaming down our faces. And about 10 days later, someone came to my father and told him that the family Rindel, that was the name, father, mother, and Lydia, had been found shot dead. And, well, that was a traumatic experience for me, obviously, and I've never forgotten it. When she said goodbye to me, she took off a little pendant of her gold chain that she wore, and it was a little golden, a tiny little pendant, a yoke with a disc turning inside, and when you twirled the disc, it spelled out, "I love you." And she gave it to me and said, "Well, whatever happens, you'll have this memento from me, and you'll twirl it every sometimes and think of me." I have a cheap replica of it in my pocket. I've carried that replica with me for decades, actually, and I've never forgotten her. On June 28th, the motorcycles and the trucks that surrounded the ghetto and the people on foot, the radios, it was announced to us that the following day we would be resettled in the East. The Germans had a wonderful way of euphemizing terrible words. Resettling in the East could mean going to Auschwitz and being gassed and just getting out of the camps via the chimney. Resettling in the East. And so on the 29th, my mother had packed a suitcase for each one of us, as mothers do. I had a piece of bread in there and sausage and underwear, of course. And we left our house, the ghetto place, the stage, and there were Jewish people from various outbuildings in the ghetto coming out under guard. We were taken down to a concentration place, which was an old junkyard, actually. And there we had to hand over all of our belongings, our valuable belongings, like coins, watches, wedding rings, gold chains, ankle chains, to the SS, who were seated behind long tables with a whip on the table and a handgun on the table. And we had to parade by and hand things over. And that's when, again, a second traumatic moment in my life occurred, because it was then that I saw for the first time people with blood streaming down from the heads over their faces, because they had been taken out of the line to be checked whether they had handed over their valuables. And I guess in some cases, people had not handed over everything and were beaten up and then literally kicked out of this barn-like building with blood flowing down the faces. I'll never forget that. Then we waited for the trains to come. But prior to that, we were separated from each other. Old people, young people, middle-aged people, men and women, all separate groups. And when I was separated from my parents, that was the SS that did that. When I was separated from my parents and was told to go over to that group, my mother ran behind me and said, Walter, don't leave us. And an SS man walked up to her and hit her over the shoulder. And I don't know what he said to her, and shoved her back into the group of middle-aged women. And I was alone. For the first time in my life, with a bunch of young people whom I had known, who had worked in a factory during night shift prior to this deportation. And I was desperate. I was scared. Everybody was scared. Again, scrolling ahead a little bit, there were 15 people and myself among the kids that I knew from that experience of working at night shift in that factory. And out of the 16, 2 survived. A fellow by the name of Berger, whom I have no contact with. He may have died. He went to Israel after liberation, and I came to via France to the United States. So that was deportation. Now, I was sort of forced through 7 different camps. Some were slave labor camps, Zwangsarbeitslager, as it's called in German, and the last 2 were concentration camps. And I cannot tell you all the things that happened in each camp, obviously. We have time limitations here, and I'm probably way too far along already. But I will tell you a little bit about general conditions and then I'll take one or two camps and tell you about them. So general conditions, food. We received about between 10 and 12 ounces of food, the only solid food per day, okay? That was handed out at night. These were round breads. My fellow prisoners got these from the refectory, and they were cut like we cut a pizza, into sectors, 8 sectors, and we picked up one of these sections as we walked by the table. And when he saw you and cut the bread and liked you or had a relationship with you, well, he cut that 8 a little bigger. Well, you can get only 8 out of one piece of bread. That meant that 1 or 2 became smaller. Well, I was a little kid, and when I walked by, nobody really gave a hoot about me, and I probably ended up with 10 ounces of bread per day. And then there was also a bowl that we had, and that was for receiving coffee, quote unquote, at night. It was bitter, lukewarm water, and that was the liquid. And then we received at the work site a soup, and that soup was made from peels, potato peels and beet peels, and they settled at the bottom. And so when we came by with our bowls, the person who used the ladle would, again, if he liked you, if he knew you from somewhere, if he could use you in some way, went down with a ladle deep. You had a plate, a bowl full of potato peels. Well, that's solid stuff. Isn't so good. Try it sometimes. But, it was solid. And then, a little kid comes by, and you take it from the top, and you have a bowl full of lukewarm water, but maybe with 12 or 20 little peels swimming around in the water. So that was food, okay? Clothing. You've seen concentration camp people on your television sets, blue, white stripes, pajama-like clothing. Well, let me tell you that the weave of this clothing was so loose that if I had a piece of it here and looked through it, I'd see you. We never received any underwear. We got a piece of clothing about that big, same stuff as the pants and the jacket was made of, to put into our wooden shoes. These were our socks. We never received any gloves. That was out of question. We had a little beret type, blue, white striped for our heads. That was the clothing. The wind blew right through you. Then there was work. We woke up and it was dark. We marched out, and we came back and it was dark. But I do want at this point to tell you what the roll call was like. Toward the last year and a half, we were sort of driven by the police, by the camp police, capos as they were called, out of our rooms, out of our barracks, to stand lined up 5 deep for the roll call. Winter or summer, rain, snow, same. We were there. Now, suppose you stand at roll call and you need to go to the bathroom. Well, I asked the students, I talked to a lot of middle school classes, what do you do when you need to go to the bathroom in the middle of a class? Well, I raise my hand, teacher, may I go to the bathroom? Of course, go, You couldn't do that. You were not allowed to do that. And so most older people who had no control over their bodies anymore, urinated into their pants and did number 2 into the pants. In wintertime, the urine would run down the legs into the wooden shoes, and the wooden shoes would actually freeze to the ground. And then after having been counted over and over and over, because the numbers never checked out, because people had died during the night, or people had been shot during the night, or people had committed suicide during the night. It never jived. So we were there for an hour, standing in the snow and ice, and people got frozen to the ground. And then came the command, turn right, march, and they couldn't move. And so we who were younger, who had more control of our bodies at that point still, would walk up to those poor people who were usually, one or two here, one there, one behind, and we would kick our wooden shoes against theirs to loosen them. And they would get loose. But what happened is that under one shoe, there would be that much snow and ice. And under the other shoe, nothing. What happens? You limp. So you march, and the guards, right and left, with their dogs and their arms, the word they always heard, that I heard from them always, schneller, 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 faster, faster, faster in German. The people would fall. We would have to walk over them. We couldn't help them. And then we heard a shot. On the way home, we saw the corpses lying in the snow. That, to me, that appel, they called it the appel, the roll call, was one of the most horrible times that I absolutely dreaded. And people lost their lives that way. So you get an idea of what life was like there. Add to this now infestation with lice during the last year and a half, 2 years. If you were infested with lice, we tried to clean ourselves up before getting into bunks, straw bunks, and tried to pull the lice out of our friends and ourselves. Be careful, because if you left a little bit in there, a little leg of a lice, tiny little thing, you get infected. And you get infected, you were as much as dead, believe me, because I lived something like that myself, came out of it alive, fortunately. But you were sent at that point to Rosen, which was the main camp of Waldenburg, my last camp. And they had a shooting wall there that was about the size from this door to that door. They lined up the people, machine gunned them, and that was the end of it. Because if you couldn't work, you were useless to the German government or to the company that employed these slaves. So add to this humiliations, filth, no water during the last 2 years, because they were losing the war, the Nazis. And that affected us in very, very bad ways, of course. Filth. Now add to that, and that is my last point describing to you life in a camp. They took away my name. In one point, I'm not sure whether it was the last camp or the previous one, they took our rags away from us that we had still brought from home or gotten during the camp experience. And after a shower, we came out, and there were benches out there, and there were bundles of clothing there. And, well, you just walked up to a bundle and took it. And you found that that bundle, that blue striped thing, had a number on it and a yellow triangle. And the number, my number happened to be 64,757, and my name was gone. Now, I want you to talk with your friends to sort of find out yourselves what it means to become a number rather than a human being with a name. There's a good reason for that, and maybe you can come up with it. I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for you. Figure it out yourselves, okay? So that was life in camp, and there was, you think that when people live together as prisoners, there'll be cohesiveness, there will be solidarity. Well, think again, because when you become a zombie, as we did, totally exhausted, skeletons that were covered with skin, you have to fight for your own life. You don't particularly care for the person next to you. You don't care for them. Except for exceptional human beings, which I was not. I didn't care. I was like the rest of us. So let me tell you one camp experience. And when did we begin? 6 o'clock, was it? Okay, well, it's not so bad. Okay, thank you. My first camp was a camp by the name of Sakrau, And all these names are German names because wherever the Germans arrived and occupied, they renamed the place. So Sakrau had a Polish name previously, and Brande, which is the camp I want to tell you about, also had a Polish name, which I'm not going to bother you with. You couldn't pronounce it anyway. So it was in December, right around Christmas time or during Christmas, that we arrived at the camp of Brande, B-R-A-N-D-E. And I remember walking through snow from where we had arrived with the train, where we had been pushed out from one side of the train, cattle trains, to the other, many people falling out, being stepped on. Well, I was pretty agile. I jumped out, got on my 2 feet, marching through the snow toward a camp, okay, a camp. And I remember distinctly seeing on the horizon little houses. That was the village of Brande, German village, Polish village, now German village. And through the windows, we saw little lights. And these lights probably were Christmas tree lights because it was Christmas time. And I sort of thought I heard little music wafting over toward us. And I sort of recognized this music, and it probably was Mozart, my guess. And we trudged through the snow, and we finally arrived, and there was a big gate, and the name of the camp was on the gate, Konzentrationslager Brande, something like that. And I heard a voice behind me saying, wow, isn't that wonderful? We are coming to the camp of Brande. That is a camp where there's nobody, there's no construction site. We're not going to have to work. This is a convalescence camp for inmates that are tired, that need to be fixed up to be able to go to work again after a while. Well, so that sounds pretty good, you know, convalescence camp. We got into Brande, and there was a roll call, of course. And interestingly, as I said my name, and that was just before we became numbers, by the way. That happened in a later camp. So I said Walter Ziffer. Now, in every camp, there was a camp commandant within the camp, a fellow prisoner, and then there were the guard outside in barracks, and there was the commander there who was a German, very often an SS or Gestapo person or what have you. So I mentioned my name, Walter Ziffer. And the inmate commandant at that point came to me and said to me, are you the son of Dr. Ziffer from Teschen, Český Těšín? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I knew your father, and you're going to be my special servant. I trust you, or something like that. So tomorrow morning, a capo, one of these camp policemen, fellow prisoners, will tell you, you know, what to do, what your job is going to be. Well, I felt good. We were dismissed. We went to the barracks that were assigned to us, bunk beds, 3 stories high, straw. And, well, I was exhausted and fell asleep. Early next morning, I was waked up by a capo who took me to the camp commandant, the prisoner camp commandant. His name was Gebührer. And he actually told me where he had lived, in a town called Bielsko, which exists today, not very far from where my town was. And there I was initiated to the job. Okay, shining of boots, he had black boots, you know, just like the Nazis. And had an Eisenhower jacket, if I remember correctly, and riding pants. And I had to make a fire early in the morning in his wood stove. And something very important, he opened the box underneath his table, opened it, and what was in the box? Bread. pieces of bread, some still in packages. So he said, mein Kleiner. If you know German, mein Kleiner means my little one. That's what he called me. There's bread down there. You can help yourself from that bread anytime you want to. But then he opened a little closet. There were jars in there. There was margarine there. There were pieces of bread in there. He said, if I ever catch you eating some of that, you're out. Well, I remembered that. I was happy there was bread there. Okay. Interestingly enough, as I later looked, the packages were addressed to inmates in that camp, which were intercepted by Mr. Gebührer, and all ended up in that box, a box that was open to people privileged like myself and certain capos, camp policemen, etc., etc. Okay, I was happy. I'm going to have a pretty good life here. Well, come the next or the after next roll call in the morning. So we stand there. Oh, there must have been, it's a small camp, less than 1,000 people, I would say. Stand there lined up, 5 deep, and the gate opens, and Mr. Pompe, P-O-M-P-E, you can find him on the internet, by the way, if you Google the name, comes in. He limps. He has a sort of a violet, dark violet uniform on, and he comes out with his whip in his hand, gun, of course, at his belt, and he comes and inspects us. And he walks by, and then he takes his whip and he hits you over the head. Just bang, and you step out. And then you, lady in white, he comes to you, he hits you on your head, you step out. And so 10 to 14 people form a separate group. And these people are marched off now by a camp policeman. We are dismissed in the sense that we go now to jobs within the camp. There was no Baustelle, no construction site, cleaning the sidewalks, in summertime cutting the grass, washing the floors in our barracks, etc., etc. And then I hear screaming coming from the wash barrack. Screaming like I've never heard of. And I don't know what this is about. And so I ask one of the inmates there, what's that screaming about? And the man listens to me, says not a word, and walks away from me. And I did that with 1, 2, possibly 3 people. Same reaction. Well, I did my job there. I don't know what I was doing. And drilling a hole, I think, into the ground. Some stick to go in there. But about 2 or 3 weeks later, a camp policeman comes to me with 2 young people with him already and says to me, come with me. And he takes us to the wash barrack, to where, again, that particular morning, those, say, 12 people had been marched off to. And I had heard that screaming. And I walk in, and what I see makes it impossible to tell you. It's beyond description, because these 12 people are corpses that are lying around the wash barrack, the showers there, in various places, in absolutely weird positions, with arms hanging from the bodies I mean, total deformed bodies. And we are ordered to take these corpses, put them on a two-wheel cart, and to cart them into neighboring woods, to dump them into a mass grave, shovel a few shovels of earth on this, return to the camp, clean up the wash barracks. These bodies lie in filth, in urine, in water, and in blood. And it's undescribable. I can see it, but I cannot convey to you really what I saw. Now I knew what happened in the wash barracks, but I still didn't know how these people were being murdered. And so, again, I asked some of the inmates that had been there before, and one person volunteered to tell me what happened. How he knew it, I do not know. But what happened is that Mr. Pompey, the head of the German Guard, who, by the way, had lost his lower leg during World War I, had his fun with these people. He gave them cold showers, and the water was ice cold all the time. But there were big vats in the wash barrack in which the inmates boiled the underwear of the guards. And that was done in families too. My mother boiled our underwear in pots. That's how it was done. Hygiene. Well, these were big vats with boiling water in there. And so, to kill these people, they were given cold showers, ice cold showers, and then via pots or pans or whatever they had there, they were, this boiling water was thrown at them alternately, while the people chased them around, the guards chased them around the building, beating them in the meantime until the people expired. Entertainment, just really pure entertainment. Whether that happened in other camps, I do not know. But again, you can read some of this online. And I told you that the camp was known as a convalescence camp. There was a scribe in that camp whose name was Bornstein. He wanted the world to know what was going on really in that camp. And so he tried to smuggle out a letter by a Polish worker who came in there to fix the plumbing or the electricity. And that letter was intercepted by the Nazis, by Mr. Pompey's people. And I happened to be present when that young man Bornstein, was brought into the refectory. And Mr. Gebührer, my boss, was already there, and there were couples there, and there were German guards there. The man is brought in, and Pompey walks up to him, pulls out the piece of paper, and says to Mr. Bornstein, this young man, very myopic character, says, "Did you write this letter?" And Bornstein said yes. And as soon as he said yes, they started beating on him with their leather whips, and they beat him until he became a piece of flesh, a hump, really a lump of flesh. You could hardly, the clothing had been beaten off him, his glasses were beaten off him, his eyes were beaten out of his sockets, and when his glasses fell off, Pompey, I can hear this to this day, stepped on it, and I hear the crushing sound of the glasses when he broke the glasses. Then they asked the couples to take that lump of flesh and dump it into the coal chute under the wash barrack. And that night, we heard howling and screaming and noises, which I've never heard before, and I hope to God I never hear again. And toward morning, all this subsided because Bornstein had died. So that was the convalescence camp of Brande, okay? There were a few other camps to follow. There was the camp of Graditz, which was an interesting camp I want to tell you about briefly. That was a German Air Force installation, and we moved machinery and furniture there. And that was a good camp because it was like a city, a small city. It was an Air Force base. And there were garbage cans there. And we marched through the town, pushing, working there and marching there and pushing the equipment around. But there were garbage cans. And the Air Force people, the German people, didn't care. They were in charge there. And so I remember picking through the garbage. And there were sandwiches there that had been thrown away that had turned green. I'm not telling you a lie here. And we ate that stuff. And we ate it ravenously. And so that was a pretty good camp, Graditz. And once, something happened that wasn't so good, because Allied bombers came and bombed the area. And when that happened, there were alarms going on during World War II when Allied planes came over the area and dropped the bombs. So we had to jump into ditches at that point. Now, I told you that we had wooden shoes with cloth tops. And these cloth tops had shoelaces in there, just regular shoelaces. But how long does a shoelace remain a shoelace? You know, when you work through dirt and filth. So shoelaces gave out. And while during that bomb raid, we were in a ditch. One of the men, not far from me, saw a piece of wire. And he jumped out of the ditch to get that piece of wire, to use it as a shoelace. He was, as soon as the alarm went off, he was taken out of the group, taken back to the camp, and was hanged in the camp. As we arrived, there were gallows, and he was swinging in the wind. And the camp commander came and gave us a big speech on how German property must never be stolen. This is wartime, and that's how you're being punished. That was Graditz. I'm trying to stay within time here. It's okay? Good. So another story now that will tell you just a little bit about what happened in Germany. I was in the camp of Schmiedeberg. That was a mountain that had been hollowed out. There was a factory in there to produce, I'm not sure, either V1s or V2s. These were missiles, but not guided missiles, that the Germans shot into England. But they just fell into fields and onto mountains and also into London and caused a lot of damage. No question about that. Well, I had a very privileged job there. We were building bunkers to test the engines of these either V1s or V2s. And these bunkers were made of concrete. We built these. So there were two plates in the ground, and concrete would be poured in. But within the concrete, there had to be a skeleton type of, a mesh type of metal. And to make that, there were rebars. You know what rebars are? That had to be bent into certain shapes. And so I got the job of working the machine that bent the rebars after a predecessor, a really nice-looking young man, had been killed on that machine. Because it was a big platform with I wish I could describe that, with a big arm that turned, and on the arm there are holes, and we put pegs, steel pegs into these holes, and then the rebar was slid in between the arm and the stationary peg, and then the arm turned and bent the rebar. And that had to be done to dimensions. I had a blueprint to go by, and the machine was set up for that. And that poor boy who was working the machine was caught by the arm, and his body was smashed. And when they pulled him out, he was either dead or whatever. I don't know. He must have died. I got the job. So it was a good job because the machine did all the work. You don't expend your personal strength. So at one point, the German engineer comes to me and says, "Follow me." And I follow him, and we go to a small little barrack place, his office on the construction site, a desk there and a cupboard. And he sits behind the desk, and he says, "We're going to change the dimension of the rebars that are being bent." And he pulls out a blueprint and puts it out before me and said, "This is the new shape. that you're going to bend to. I was a pretty smart little kid, and I was by then probably 16 years old. And the dimensions showing you where to bend and which way. And then there's a dimension for the total length as well. And the little one dimensions, the short ones, have to add up to the total. Simple stuff, arithmetic. And so I added them up, and they didn't add up. And so I'm standing in front of him. He sits behind his desk. And I said to him, "Sir, there's something wrong." My native language is German, by the way. That's what we spoke at home. I went to Czech school, so Czech is also my native language. But I spoke to him German. I said, "Sir, this doesn't work." And as soon as I say this, he just sits there, he shakes his head, and says nothing. And that went on for a little while. And I just stand there, in my concentration camp clothes, scared to death. And then he comes out and says, "You're not a Jew." Hello? I said, "Sir, I am a Jew. That's why I'm here." In German, of course. And again, there's silence, and he shakes his head. He said, "No, you're not a Jew. You cannot be a Jew," he said. And I said to him, "Why can't I be a Jew? I am a Jew." He says, "Because Jews are not able to speak German." Education, okay? I don't know from whom he learned it. But this has a good ending, because after he said that, he walked up to his cupboard and took out his lunchbox and gave me half of his sandwich. So I'm telling you this story because you are in a school here. And from what I hear, this is a darn good school. And the teachers are darn good teachers. And you get a darn good education. But the kids in Germany did not. The kids in Germany were told lies from first grade on. And I have some instruction books at home. I didn't bring any, but you can come and visit me, and I'll show him to you. Where from page 1 to page 82, it's one solid lie about the Jews. And that's how people learn how to behave, because they believe this kind of stuff. And then they act it out, and they did. Well, that was Schmiedeberg. And I come to my last camp, and that was Waldenburg, which is a city which is south of the city of Breslau. Breslau was a very, very important German city. There's a big Jewish background to it itself, too. So we were skeletons. We were zombies at that point. We couldn't think anymore, because when you get that little food, when you are beaten, when you're infested, when you see corpses all around you. I woke up one morning, and there was a naked corpse next to me. Why naked? Because other people saw the man die, and they wanted his pants and his jacket to add to their own, to keep the cold out, So, you just lose all your orientation. No calendar, no time. There was dark and light, day and night. That's all we knew. Time-wise, was it 11 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon? No idea. Zombies. So in Waldenburg, there was a construction site. And in Waldenburg, we were supposed to lower a huge territory of rock, solid rock, to a lower level. Well, they didn't have the machinery at that point. It was getting pretty late during the war. And so we were drilling holes. And in order to get there, we had to march through Main Street of Waldenburg. Well, we marched through the city, and it was still dark, usually. And there were apartment houses right and left. And I remember looking longingly into the windows of these apartment houses, because that reminded me of my past. That's how we lived, decently, humanly, in apartments. And every so often, I saw the Venetian blinds move or a curtain move, and I saw a part of a face peeking through. These were Germans, whom we woke up because the guards cursed us, and there were shots fired every so often, and the dogs barked, and so they came to the windows to see what was happening. After the war, all these people said, oh, we didn't know. We had no idea there was a camp in town. But they did. And so at this point, we passed by a church. It was dark, as I said, foggy. And I see a person running out from behind the church with a little package, and that person throws a package into our ranks. I happened to catch that package. It was just a little thing about that big, about that thick, and the hands all over me right now. They want to grab this piece, whatever it is in there, from me. Well, we rip open the paper. It was 2 slices of bread with a little margarine in between. Call that a sandwich if you want to. Okay? So I really was able to get a piece of bread into my mouth. The rest of it was gone. It was taken by others. Shots rang out. And we marched on. I was very grateful. I didn't think, but I was grateful for that piece of bread. It made all the difference in my life. And so we march on. We dig holes into the bedrock with big rods, steel rods, about that big around, about 6.5 feet tall. Two people opposite each other, holding the rod, lifting it a foot, letting it drop, lifting it, turning it, letting it drop, lifting it, turning it, letting it, until a hole was made about that big. Then we were evacuated. The Germans came in, put dynamite into the holes, blew it up, and the new level was exposed, okay? I mean, I'm simplifying things for you because while we were doing it, we were cursed and we were beaten, and, well, you can imagine all the rest. So I get back to camp at night, and I want to take my shoe off, and my shoe is stuck to something. I managed to get it off. Then there's that little piece of cloth. It's stuck to my foot, and I take that off, and my foot is damaged because I told you that shot rang out. I don't think anybody shot into my shoe, but it may have been a ricocheted bullet. I have no idea. It was so cold, there was practically no blood there. There was a viscous fluid there, yellowish. You're a zombie. You don't know what's going on. So I climbed into my straw bunk, went to sleep. And that went on for 2 days, 3 days. Eventually, my foot started turning greenish and purplish, and I swelled up. I couldn't get back into my shoe. So I went to the little hospital, quote unquote. There were 2 Dutch doctors there, Jewish doctors, inmates, who said, oh my God, you should have come here earlier. This is no good. This is really no good. I hope you're not going to lose your foot. Okay, that's what he said. They cleaned up the wound. Alcohol, I went through the ceiling. But you still don't understand what's going on. You're in a different world. And then they hid me under the bunk bed with sheets hanging down on both sides, and at the top, I was on the floor underneath. How they managed the roll call, I do not know. They did it. I remember one thing that I want to share with you. At one point, somebody picked up that sheet to put a bowl with soup toward me. And I peeked out, and I saw 6 feet away from me a foot that had 5 black toes, and a hand with a pair of pliers. And when I say pliers, I mean pliers. Those pliers that go like that, whoop, picking off the toes. And it did nothing to me. I pulled in the bowl of soup and ate it ravenously. I'd become a complete zombie. I didn't understand what was going on. I was healed, my foot healed, and went back to work, and that was toward the end. So people took their lives, they put their lives online, like these two doctors, to save my life. Because had an SS person found out what they had done, hiding me, it would have been the end for that person. So let me tell you about my liberation. It was roll call in Waldenburg. Again, we stand there and we wait, to be told, turn right, march. There was a triple fence around these camps. The inner fence was a low wire that was electrically charged. And every other day, there were people hanging on that wire who had committed suicide. There were 3 gates. The two high fences had a gate, and then that little thing was stopped there and had a little gate. So the gate opened, and the German SS commander comes in. He walks up to the internal commander, and they exchange some words. He comes in all alone, mind you, okay? And then he turns around and walks out. In the meantime, I look at the towers that surround the camp that have a machine gun up there and a big reflector to light up the camp at night. And I notice, despite my zombieism, that there's nobody up in those towers. There's nobody there. Well, I noticed it, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. And so, okay, this guy comes in, he walks out, and as he walks out, he takes a big key ring from his belt and throws it into the camp across the fence. And we stand there, and we have no idea what's going on, because I wasn't the only zombie. We were all zombies. We couldn't figure out what was going on. We stand there, waiting for the command, turn right, march. And then we heard an engine sound coming closer and closer and closer. And around the corner of the camp comes a single Soviet tank. There was a soldier standing in the turret, and the tank drives into the fences and smashes one whole side of the fence, of the triple fence, smashes it, and keeps on going. And we stand there, and we have no idea what's going on. And so we stand there, I'm guessing maybe half an hour. And then the guy next to me says, "I think it's over," he said. "Let's organize some food." That's camp language. Organize means try to get some food. And so he and I leave. The rows were breaking up at that point, but he and I walked out of the camp into the city of Waldenburg, down there. Main street, where we had marched through every time, totally abandoned, nobody in the streets. And we see a truck standing there, and we climb on the truck, a German military truck, and there are shelves in there, and on the shelves are cans. And so this fellow who is older than I got a screwdriver from somewhere and would punch holes into the cans, pry open the cans, and it's white grease, but it smells deliciously. It was pork grease. And we go in with our hands and shove it into our mouths, and underneath that much grease, there's pork, the chunks of meat. And we eat that, and we open can after can. Can't tell you how many cans. And then we spot 3 or 4 sacks in the truck bed. We slice that open, and it's sugar. And we get on our fours, and we shove sugar into our mouths. And then everything went black. And I remember nothing. And then I woke up. I'm still here. I must have woken up. So I woke up, and I'm in a bed between 2 white sheets. And I look to the right, there's another bed there, and this other guy is in that bed. And opposite me is a cuckoo clock. And I do not know where I am. I think at that point, now, maybe what I'm going to tell you now is something that I acquired later. But I didn't know whether I was in heaven or in hell. Because, in religion classes, we learned about heaven and hell. Well, in heaven, where there are these little cute kids with red cheeks up here, red cheeks down here, and little wings, and they weren't there. And hell, well, clearly this wasn't hell. You don't lie in hell between two white sheets with a cuckoo clock. So that may have been something I invented later on. It's possible. But then the door opened, and the tiny little woman, maybe 4.5 feet tall, dressed in black, came into the room. She saw me lying there with open eyes, and she sat down on my bed next to me, and she said to me in German, of course, jetzt ist alles vorüber, wir haben den Krieg verloren, Sie sind frei. Now it's all over, we've lost the war, you are free. And I heard that. And I fell back asleep. I mean, I didn't jump out and do some kind of a ritual dance. We were totally exhausted. And then I woke up a second time, and that was better because this other guy was waking up too. And we stayed with this woman, and she cooked enormous pots of potato soup, good stuff for us, carrots in it, I remember that quite well. And we stayed. But you see, the thing is, you don't know what to do with yourself, because every decision for 3 years that I was in these camps was made for me. And I had gotten into the camp as a youngster. You don't know what to do with yourself. Where do you go? Well, we finally made a decision. We went into the basements of these abandoned houses. We broke into stuff that was stored there, all kind of cases and boxes. We got ourselves clothes and got rid of this stinking, messy, filthy, pajama-like clothes that were the inmate clothes. And then we had to make a second decision. What do we do with ourselves? So we went back to camp, of course, to our home, you see. And nothing had changed. Everybody was still there. There were little fires going here and there. People were roasting maybe a rabbit or something, or a piece of bread, or toast, I don't know. And so we just wait. We wait for Godot. Godot didn't show up. Women started coming to the camp. And I remember 3 women standing by this destroyed fence. And I really cranked up my courage. I was very shy. I was scared of my own shadow. Walked up to the women and said, by any chance, while you were in your concentration camps, they had the same garbs on, the blue-white stuff. Did you ever run into a woman or 2 women by the name of Ziffer, my name? And one of the women looked at me and said, yes, there were 2 Ziffer women in my barrack. Wow. Where? In Langenbielau. Langenbielau was a concentration camp for women. Where is that? 30 kilometers from here. So I made my first decision. Maybe my zombiehood lifted at that point a little bit. I walked down into the city of Waldenburg, nobody there. And here comes one person on a bicycle. And I walked toward him, he came toward me, and I did this. I said, get off the bike. And he did. He got off the bike. We looked like hell, if I may say so, because we had come from hell, not the kind of hell that the Bible talks about. This was real hell. Person got off, I got on the bike. I swear I don't know how I did this. It took me 2 days to bicycle to Langenbielau, which is about 16 miles or something like that. And I arrived at the camp, at the women's camp. Well, let me tell you something. The women were much more advanced than the men. Where are the Ziffers? Oh, they are in that barrack over there. I walk over there and hear the women, oh, you're the son of the Ziffers? Yes. They had food, good food. I don't know how they did this, but that's women. And so invited me. The Ziffers aren't here. They are out organizing food, you know. So I sat down, I ate, and I sat by the door waiting for someone to come in. And it was half the distance from here to that door. And I waited. And then the door opened, and my mom marched in, and my sister came with her, and a cousin, who later we found out had lost both her parents in Auschwitz. And they came in loaded with stuff, paper bags. They had organized food. And I was sitting there, and they came by, and they looked at me, and they smiled. And they walked into the corner of the barrack and started unloading the food. I had to walk over there and introduce myself to my mom. I was a skeleton, and we hadn't seen each other for 3 years. And, well, I don't need to go into details about that reunion because it was fantastic. I mean, there was a lot of crying going on. So we stayed in that camp then, and there were 2 men that joined us that seemingly came from the same area where we lived, and then started a long trek home. And that was extremely difficult because all the bridges had been bombed out by the retreating German army. And that whole area was liberated by Soviet troops. And these troops were consisted of people from the far, far east, who seemingly didn't have the kind of Western culture that we had. And I hate to say this, but it had to be said that these men who had liberated these women in the concentration camps were raping these same women. And so we traveled only at night. We didn't travel at daytime. It was peasants who put us up in various outbuildings and barns and fed us. They gave us milk, they gave us bread, they gave us some hot soup, and we stayed in the straw. And then at night we started walking, and they had horse-drawn carriages, helped us go back home. We arrived in our town. There was one woman who came up to us, just sad as can be, and said, "Oh, Mrs. Ziffer, you have come back." Oh, and walked away. Sad as can be. I can tell you more about that if you have any questions about it. Then a second woman came up, smiling, happy. "Oh, Mrs. Ziffer, you came back. You survived. Wonderful. Do you know your husband is in town?" No, we didn't know that. We had not known that for years. We had not known what had happened to my father. And so where was he? He was in the little apartment of our maid, whom I mentioned before. And so my mom dispatched me to get my father. And Malchi, the name of this woman, opened the door. And I mean, she was so happy to see me. And I asked, "Where's my father?" And my father was in a room adjoining that entrance hall in a corner looking at the wall. And I walked up to him and I said, we called him Tati, "I'm here." I have problems with this. And he hardly recognized me. He showed no emotion. And I finally just took him with me back to my mom. And, well, that's basically the end of the story, because here another chapter begins. Because we were reunited, and I don't want to go into details about that, but to make a long story short, in 1947, it so happened that we heard about communists being ready to take over our country. And I had just lost years that should have gone to an education like you people are lucky enough to have it here. And so I begged my father, who had recovered somewhat, can I get out? Can you help me to get out of here? I wanted to leave Europe. And my father had a friend in Prague, high placed in the government somehow. And I somehow got a passport, and I got a visa to go to Paris, France for 7 days. And I went. And that was a blessing. The only blessing that I'm sad about didn't occur is that my whole family got out. I was the only one to get out. My sister remained with my father, was by the side of my mom and dad when they died, and I was in America, and I started a new life. And let me say this, to end this, the story is scary to me. As I think back, I'm a free person, but as I think back and realize what happened to these Germans who became Nazis, and everybody didn't become a Nazi, as I pointed out. I wonder, and I'm asked quite often, can a thing like this happen here in America? And I have the tendency, of course, to say no, because I know about schools and people like you. I know, that it's crazy. This is insane to think. And yet, we must not make the mistake of thinking that it's impossible, because the DNA of a German is the same as the DNA of an American. And if it happened to them, if they were sucked into this hole of cruelty, it can happen to us too, unless we listen very, very, very much and carefully to our teachers, whom we have here, and who hopefully are good teachers, I think are good teachers in this school from what I've heard, and internalize that, and resist any kind of overture that's being made by people outside of us to, for instance, build big fences not to let refugees in, or who building water cannons or gas to disperse people like that who have nothing, just the bare lives, and who are looking for freedom, for a chance to live like a human being. Unless we take our education seriously, which I think at this point is still solid because of our institutions, which have not been messed up yet, and hope never will be, it can happen to us. It can happen to us. So let's be careful about that. And so I want to leave you with a statement by a man whose name is John Shar. I had never heard of him before until I found him in a book. I can't even tell you what book it was in. But a man who is truly an American prophet, who says this, listen to this carefully. He says, "The future is not some place we are going, but one we are creating. The paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination." If you want this in writing, send me an email, I'll give it to you. But this is profound, and this is what education is all about, and this is what internalizing the education you get means. This means being a good person, and we have to choose to be good persons. This is not given to us automatically. So be good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for a question period, do we?
Yes, yeah, about 15 minutes.
How much?
15.
15 minutes. Well, let me say this before we get into the question period. Our teachers here have my email. If you have any question that you would like to get answered in more detail, then I'll be able to offer you here. Please send me an email. You won't get an answer the next day, probably not the next week, but you will get an answer, I guarantee you that. And that's a solid promise that I'm making. Because to me, this question period, 15 minutes, alas, is maybe the most important thing that we have together. Because you have questions that I cannot guess, okay? So let's go. Any question goes.
I have a question.
Yes. Can I have help for this here? Because somebody needs to repeat the question.
Is that on?
I forgot my hearing aids at home.
Oh.
Very useful. Okay.
Well, thank you first of all for being here. Thank you first of all for being here.
Thank you.
It's really an honor.
Thank you. Thank
And when you were getting your foot healed, and you were under the sheet, how many days were you there?
you. I wish I knew. You know, when you become a zombie, you don't know these things.
Sure.
I mean, there's light, there's darkness. I was scared most of the time, as I was for 3 years. You know, that looking over your back, where you didn't have to look back, you could look in front in the camps as well. You live under a cloud of fear. Because every time there's a roll call, and this guy comes out and looks at you for no darn reason that I understand, and says, okay, you come out here. You know, this can be a death sentence. Certainly at Brande it was a death sentence. And so the major effort that had to be made, and that I made, was to make myself invisible. Never draw attention of a guard to you. Never. Because that was always catastrophic, one way or another. I mean, they beat you up, and you know, you get hurt, and that's the end of your life. There's no hospital. I mean, the hospital I mentioned had aspirin and a scalpel and alcohol. That's all they had. That you call that a hospital. See?
And
So it may have been, I would say, maybe 3, 4, 5 days, something like that.
and when you were in there, every morning you had roll call, and all of a sudden you weren't there for a couple of
That's
days.
right.
When you came back, did anybody ask you where you were?
No. How they managed the roll call, I have no idea.
Thank you.
But I wasn't the only problem, you see. The problem was that people died. People were murdered. Some people died of exhaustion. Some were shot on the way to the work site. Some were shot on the way back. People died in the straw. The numbers never checked out. And that's why we were counted, whether it was snow or ice or rain, for an hour maybe. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., as we stood there, you know. So, I mean, I wish I could explain to you all this very logically. I'm not capable of doing it because I just don't know how they managed this. I have no idea. And some camps were better, relatively better than others. There's no question about it. When I worked at Machine, bending the rebars, that was a really good job that I was very grateful for. And Brande was a death camp. No, not like Auschwitz, where thousands of people were killed every day, but 10, 12, 14 people were killed there. So, you know, it varied. This man, Pompey, was evil personified. That's all I can say. I mean, I could tell you other stories about him. I can tell you stories that a person whom I know in Michigan who happened to research that camp. I was there only for about half a year, and I had a privileged position, as I mentioned. There were people before I came there, and there were people after I left. And there are stories that are unbelievable. I mean, the man was a maniac. He hated us. And I was at Heidelberg University just 10 days ago, where I spoke. And there I spoke very briefly about this man, by the way, that particular camp, But I also try to bring this into some kind of a relationship with an explanation of evil, of ultimate evil. And I'm not a psychologist, but I've read up on, for instance, evolutionary psychology and other kinds of psychology. And there are answers to how evil continues to exist and how people fall into this hole. And even if they want to get out, can no longer go out. This is not the place, obviously, we can do this. We don't have the time. But psychology and sociology and even theology has done a lot of progress, or have done a lot of progress in researching these phenomena and coming up with some interesting answers that make a lot of sense. There's a book by James Waller that I would recommend to you. And I'm not sure what the title is. It has evil in it. I think it's called On Becoming Evil. I met the man, actually, here in North Carolina. And he came up to me after he heard me speak, and he gave me his book, which is an absolutely remarkable book. James Waller, W-A-L-L-E-R. I would recommend it to you. Evil. Yes. Questions?
When, is it on? When you were in Heidelberg and you were talking to the students,
You in Heidelberg and talking to the students?
Yeah.
when you were in Heidelberg and talking to the students, how well informed were they about World War II, the Nazis, all of that?
You done?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. No, I was there. I gave two speeches, and then I participated, I think, in 2 classes. Isn't that right? And then during lunchtime, one of the professors brought in another 10 or 12 people, totally unannounced, and they had questions. And I think they were psychology, sociology majors, I'm not sure. So, I did not have a whole lot of contact with the students. But let me say this, that the questions that were asked were very intelligent questions. And let me also add to that is not necessarily the fact on other campuses. Gail, my wife, and I saw 2 programs on television, one at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a top-notch university. One of my daughters went there. And the other one was at Texas Tech, I think it's called, or something like that. And there was a sort of a roving journalist that went into the campus at the University of Pennsylvania and asked questions about Hitler, about the Holocaust, about World War II. These kids knew nothing. I mean, nothing from nothing. I tell you one question that particularly struck me. She asked one student, I think it was a black student, if I'm not mistaken, who won the Civil War? And there was hesitancy there on the part of the student. And then the person said, Americans? You get it? At Texas Tech, something similar happened. I don't remember the details anymore. Was that at Texas Tech? Okay, I did backwards. So, that blows my mind. However, because things work out the way they work out, the Holocaust is receding into the past. I'm 90 years old. I just passed 90 in March. How long am I going to live? And if I even live 3 more years, 5 more years, 10 more years, how long can I come to a school like this and talk? Okay? I mean, I find it increasingly difficult. And so, were it not for my wife, as I said before, forget it. I wouldn't be here. I mean, one needs support for this sort of thing. And it's not exactly fun to talk about these things. I mean, when I know, I'm fully aware that when I started talking about my father, my voice started cracking up. And that's happened every time, because my father and my mom are just the most wonderful people I can think of that were so good to me. And so I choke up. I get it out finally, you know. At least you know how I feel about them. Feel about your parents the same way. I hope you can. I hope it's possible. But parents make children what they are. It's not just schools. If the beginning isn't right, chances are that what follows isn't going to be right either.
Probably have time for one more question. Sure, back there. Yeah, standing. Gray shirt. Yeah. Microphone. Okay, sure.
Okay.
See if we can get to.
Is this? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I was wondering, how did you keep moving forward in such rough, I don't even know if that's the right word to use, but in the environment you were in, how did you keep moving forward and keep going?
In camp or after?
In camp.
In camp. I tell you, okay. I'll rephrase this question because I'm getting it usually after my talks here and there. How do you manage to survive? Okay, is that pretty much the same thing? Okay, so I'll address myself to that. 90% or more pure luck. Okay? You have to accept that. I can't tell you anything more than that. But the 10%, and I mean the percentages are obviously sort of my approach. I can't prove to you how many percents are here or there. But one other percent is the fact that I spoke fluently German. Every bit as good German as any of those people that I encountered spoke, okay? And so when we were building the Autobahn, for instance, in the first camp, the Autobahn were these beautiful expressways in Germany that Hitler is responsible for. So the Autobahn is up here, and there are two slopes. And these two slopes had to be graded correctly with a rake, raked correctly, and then there was grass put on there, etc., etc. So the German goes to a Jew that comes out of somewhere back in Poland who doesn't understand German, who has never seen a rake, because he spent most of his life studying the Bible or the post-biblical literature, the Talmud, you know. He's a weak person physically. I was pretty strong, short, but, you know, hefty. So he comes to him and says, here's a rake, okay? Rake that smoothly so that we can plant grass later on. The guy has no idea what side of the rake to use. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That's how it was. And so he takes the rake and starts raking, and he's making holes instead of going smooth. And he just uses the wrong side of the rake, for all that I know. And then he gets slapped and beaten by that guard or by that pseudo-engineer, okay? And then he gets injured. And that can be the end of his life. Something as banal and stupid as using a rake can bring about death, okay? So that's another 5%. I'll give you the other 5%. Maybe it's more than that. And that 5% comes from my wife, to whom I, of course, opened my life when we got married. She knows every bit as much about my life as I, pretty much so. And so I told her about my parents, and back to my parents, and the kind of relationship that my parents offered to me. My father was the most patient person with me, not necessarily with other people, but with me he was patient. On Sunday morning, we went for a walk, every Sunday morning, my sister and I on either side of my dad. And that was a period for asking questions, because my father had given me one of his 2,000 books right at the right time when I was able to absorb what was in that book. He was wonderful in choosing the literature that he gave us. And then he said, okay, if you don't understand something, let's talk about it on Sunday. And we walked then through nature, and he explained to us. And when he didn't know or couldn't know, he said, I'll find out. And he did. So my father and my mother gave me identity. I knew I was somebody. I knew that I was not a piece of trash or a piece of, pardon the expression, shit, because this is what they called us in camp. You piece of shit. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? They called us du dreckige Saujude, you filthy Jew swine. This is how I was addressed, okay? Well, that somehow, despite my zombiehood, did not sink in, because I knew that I was something better than that. And that is due to the relationship that my father and mother offered me. I was somebody to myself. So that adds up to 100%.
We have time for one more question.
How did you, for example,
Sorry, the woman in the back has the microphone. I apologize. Please.
So, how did you overcome the trauma of everything that you experienced?
Well, okay. It wasn't easy, okay? It took a long time. And I had a hard time overcoming this after I came home to my hometown. I mean, the situation had completely changed. We were given a tiny apartment for 5 people, the 4 of us, and then my cousin who lost her parents. And that was a very difficult time. I worked in a garage I was an apprentice auto mechanic. And I had a wonderful mechanic, master mechanic, who knew where I was coming from, a man by the name of Vasek, who taught me a lot of things and actually contributed to my desire, which I'd had before but now was strengthened, to become a mechanical engineer, which I became, and worked as such for 6-7 years with General Motors. When I came to America, I met exclusively good and nice people. And that's just a fact. It's other people who make you who you are, probably the 90%. The 10% maybe was my effort as well, or my achievement, maybe. But I went to high school, and I had had 4 years of grammar school in Europe. I was enrolled at Hume Folk Technical and Vocational High School in Nashville, Tennessee, in 12th grade. And I worked day and night with my uncle and aunt, with whom I lived for a while, and I graduated, okay? They enrolled me then at Vanderbilt University. My aunt, my uncle's wife, took me to the dean of Vanderbilt Engineering School. And he said, yeah, but you have only 6 credits. We can't take you into the engineering curriculum. I think 16 were used or needed, whatever. Well, she was an extremely good-looking woman. And she started flirting with him. I was well aware of that. And he finally said, well, Mrs. Borger, we'll take him. If he passes the first quarter in engineering school, he can stay. If he doesn't pass the first quarter, he's got to go back to high school. So I passed the first quarter. It wasn't brilliant, I assure you. It was some B's and some C's, and I didn't make a single D. But I passed, and I stayed in engineering school. And I graduated 4 years later. Again, it was not spectacular, my grade average, but I think was a C+ or something like that, enough for General Motors to employ me. And there I got, in the 6 years that I was at GM, I got 5 United States patents. And I can prove that to you because I still have them. And then I switched over to biblical studies and theology, went back to graduate school, and there I did well. and, and that has been the case more or less, I think, to this day. So I don't know whether that sort of answers your question, but it was I give credit to the people that were kind to me. I told Gail the other day, the guy who flunked me in engineering school, I took thermodynamics, which is a very difficult course. There's a lot of calculus involved. I flunked it. And that same professor invited me to give a speech in Gainesville, Florida, to the Southeast Assembly of to the ASME, the Association of Mechanical Engineers. No, I mean, I had a hard time studying with 2 kids jumping in my bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that dog at 6:30, and I lived in the living room. I mean, I did the best I could. And I think a good person sees what's in the other person, sees the values, the potential that's there. You don't just turn it off because he doesn't look right or doesn't dress correctly, or is a refugee, or is something or another. The American people are good people. I stand by that. Well, we could all be a bit better. Well, who doesn't? but we are good. You know.
Just how I remembered when I was 15. Beautiful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.